Welcome, Read Through the Word, friends. Today is July 6th. I hope you're having a great day. Today we are talking about, we're digging into some of the Psalms, which I always love. And the message for today is looking for justice. So the Hebrew designation for Psalms is Tehillim, meaning praises. And in the Greek Septuagint, Psalmoi, which literally means twangings of harpstring, or alternatively, Psalterion, meaning psaltery, or a collection of harp songs. And that's very much what we know, very much in line with what we know about the Psalms. But there's an interesting part of one of these Psalms that gives us a bigger picture of what the theme is of certain Psalms. And that is that some Psalms contain what we call curses and imprecations. The Bible contains a number of examples of these when basically the writer is praying for someone else's destruction. They're calling on God to take up action against an enemy, sometimes rather brutally, but it's a prayer of, God, there's been an injustice, or we are oppressed, or God, deal with my enemy. An example from today's reading is chapter 10, verse 15. Where the psalmist says, "Break the arm of the wicked and evil man. Call him to account for his wickedness that would not be found out." Another example is chapter 10, verse 7, which says, "His mouth is full of curses and lies and threats. Trouble and evil are under his tongue." And the Archaeological Bible mentions that curses, lies, and threats were the three most common weapons of the tongue employed by ancient Near Eastern peoples. So this psalmist is saying, like, these are weapons being used against me. Curses, lies, threats. These are weapons being used against me. And these weapons were taken seriously. If today you were to say, that someone was cursing you, or and we have maybe a very different definition. It could be maybe just someone maligning or slandering us. But the idea of curses is not something we really talk about. But we do understand what it is like for someone to speak ill of us, or to someone to speak unjustly of us. In this situation, it was definitely lies of the tongue, but also definitely in physical battle as well. The physical battle that came behind these accusations and these curses. So when people of the ancient Near East, when they were seeking some kind of justice, they would try to sort of manipulate supernatural powers with some kind of ritual words, ritual actions, something to achieve destruction of their enemies. And they maintained a very large conventional stock of magic curses. These kinds of prayers were common in the ancient world. There's archaeological evidence of curses and imprecations from Egypt, ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, the Greco-Roman world. And remember, the Israelites were not living in a vacuum. They were definitely affected by their culture. And I know we've talked about this before. For example, there's a psalm, multiple psalms that talk about sort of what we call like the abyss, or the mighty waters, or the raging waters. And I think I did a lesson on this last spring, where there was very much this idea in the ancient world that like down in a sea or a lake or whatever, like that was like the abyss. And it was like representative of chaos, going back to certain creation stories and things. And so the ancient Israelites were not immune from this kind of thinking. There was this thought of the abyss is like No one wants to go there. No one's building lake houses on, near the ocean or whatever. But what was different was that the Israelites realized that God was sovereign over whatever they feared this abyss was. God was sovereign over any kind of chaos or evil. So again, what we should always remember when we're reading the Bible, these people were not living like in a vacuum outside of their culture. They very much were a part of their culture in many ways, and their culture a part of them. And yet, we also see the differences. So it's important to see that too. And the main difference is that when we read the Psalms, we do not see the Israelites using their own personal magic, using spells, using chants, using some kind of ritual thing to manipulate a God into doing what they wanted. They called on a personal God to act with justice. And they called on him as like, we know this God is listening to us. He's dwelling with us, right? God dwelt with his people. And so this God was dwelling with them, acting on their behalf, listening to them, caring about them, loving them, teaching them. And that's the big difference. And so we have to, it's kind of good to see both sides of the perspective here. Now, it's not always that God's people always had the right motive, and we know that. We don't always have the right motive when we pray for certain things either. There wasn't always a motive of love or of care or of humility when they wanted certain things. But we do not see evidence that they were calling down certain magical, pagan type, ritualistic prayers. They were talking to a personal God. Right motives all the time? Definitely not. But certainly they were different from the culture around them in that way. In the way that they addressed a personal God, and in the way that oftentimes they would leave it to God. Now, sometimes they took things in their own hands and they were like, yes, I'm praying to you. And we've read that in Kings and Chronicles, certain times leaders go ahead and God is like, this is not what I'm asking you to do, but they go ahead and they enter a battle or they try to conquer a certain nation, and that's not what God was asking them to do. And I think we can understand this today. We're not living in, daily, the ancient Near East is just a culture of a lot of bloodshed and war and violence. And we're not living in that daily, but we understand what it means to be wronged. We understand what it means to experience injustice. And I don't think any of us are using magical prayers or imprecations, but it is good for us to know and remember that the God we're praying to is personal, and that the motive of our heart can very much be that we are trusting God to take care of this injustice. Now, certainly, sometimes we need to act on injustice, and we need to do something, in the legal world or whatever. And there are, we have law enforcement and courts and things, and that is important. But at the same time, to know that ultimately justice comes from God. And that though we might need to pursue other forms of justice, ultimately, justice is going to come from God. And that when we call on him in our time of need, when we've experienced gossip or judgment or slander or injustice, and all of us have experienced that in some way. I know I have. And it's so hard to trust that God is listening. Like, God, are you listening to my prayer? And so I just wanted to just think about, in applying this to us today, what are some ways that instead of sort of calling down lightning on the enemy, what are some ways that we can, in our hearts, just settle in a position of trust, knowing that God hears us, that he sees, he hears, he knows. And so I just marked a couple of verses here from our reading today. Psalm chapter 1, verse 3. Talks about the person who delights in the Lord, he is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. So when we keep ourselves planted tight into the love of Jesus, yes, we might have been wronged, but we will grow and we will thrive. We can continue to heal and thrive and grow no matter what has been done to us. Another one is chapter 10, verse 14. It says, "But you, O God, do see trouble and grief. You consider it to take it in hand. The victim commits himself to you. You are the helper of the fatherless." Verse 17 says, "You hear, O Lord, the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them and you listen to their cry." And also verse 18, "Defending the fatherless and the oppressed, in order that man who is of the earth may terrify no more." Psalm 33 was also in our reading today. There's a couple verses there that I found encouraging. Psalm 33 verse... Oops, I am on the wrong chapter. Okay, I marked the wrong place. Okay, Psalm 33 verse 5. "The Lord loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of his unfailing love." He loves justice, and it doesn't always feel like that. And I will put some more verses to just bring encouragement to you. But God sees and God knows, and we have a very real personal God to call on. He's not far off. We don't have to conjure up our own revenge, our own way that we think it should be done. We can rest solidly knowing that Jesus sees and knows that he's empathetic, and that he himself was treated unjustly, wasn't he? And so he knows our plight, and he will not leave us, and he will continue to sit with us and to help us during these times. So I hope you have a great day, friends, and we'll see you next time on Read Through the Word.